My name is Savannah Parker and I am 63 years old. I never imagined that a simple walk on the mountain path would become the moment that shattered everything I thought I knew about family, love, and truth. The air was thin that afternoon, crisp with the sharp bite of early autumn. The leaves rattled like brittle paper in the wind, and the sky stretched endlessly above us, blue and merciless. My husband walked beside me, steady as always, his hand brushing mine now and then as though to remind me that even in the wilderness, I was not alone. Behind us trailed my son and his wife, my own daughter-in-law, though I had noticed something strange in their footsteps. Too close, too eager. There was no conversation between them, only glances I could not quite decipher. Still, I ignored the prickle in my chest. I had always believed blood would not betray me. Then, without warning, hands shoved hard against our backs. The world tipped. My husband's fingers grazed mine as the mountain vanished beneath us. We fell, a scream catching in my throat, the rocks rushing up faster than breath. When I landed, agony tore through my ribs and the iron taste of blood filled my mouth. The world spun, blurred, until the sound of his voice pierced the haze. Don't move. Pretend to be dead. It was a whisper, broken and raw, yet fierce enough to slice through the roar in my head. My husband's eyes locked on mine, wide and urgent. His own body twisted unnaturally on the jagged stone above us. I heard laughter fading with footsteps, my son's voice tangled with hers. As if the world had become theirs alone now that we were gone, I forced my chest to still, each shallow breath a knife. Minutes crawled like hours, and when silence finally returned to the mountain, I turned toward my husband. His face was ashen, his lips trembling not only from pain but from something deeper, something he had carried for far too long, and that was when he revealed to me a truth more terrible than the fall itself. My love, he rasped, each word snagging on pain. If I don't make it, you have to hear this. You have to know why they did it, and why I told them to. For a second, the mountain withdrew into silence so complete it felt like a held breath of God. I stared at him, frozen in my false stillness, my pulse a buzzing insect trapped in a jar. I wanted to ask what he meant, but even a whisper could betray that we lived. So I looked him in the eyes I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. The eyes that had laughed, argued, forgiven, and I waited for the words that would rewire my life. He swallowed, and the sound of it was more terrible than a scream. 15 years ago, he whispered, barely shaping air. I made a deal, one of those devil bargains that men tell themselves they can control. I thought I was saving us. I thought I was saving our son. A pebble dislodged somewhere above, skittered down past us, and leapt into the emptiness. The mountain smelled of pine pitch and old storms. My cheek pressed against the cold stone until it numbed. He kept speaking, each syllable a broken wing. Our boy, he said. He was 20, restless, always reaching for more. He fell in with people who taught him how easy it is to get rich. If you stop believing that lines matter. He took money that wasn't his. He thought he could put it back before anyone noticed. But the man he took it from wasn't the kind you pay back. He was the kind who takes interest in blood. My son. My bright, difficult boy who had thrown baseballs at our garage door until the paint cracked. Who had whispered to me at 13 that he hated the way the world looked down on him. When he walked into a room with second-hand shoes and a second-hand dream. I pictured him at 20 with a dead-eyed grin, thinking the world finally owed him something. I had blamed college friends, bad luck, the economy. I had never blamed his father. They were going to break him, my husband said. They were going to make an example of him. So I went to the man. I asked what it would take to make this disappear, and the word formed on my lips but didn't leave them. He heard it anyway. I signed over the mineral rights to the lower acres, he said. Land your grandfather left you. Land we never touched because it felt like a promise not to. Savannah, I gave it to them. I told myself it was just dirt. I told myself our boy's bones were worth more than any inheritance. I told myself I'd get it back. His breath hitched. But there was something beneath that dirt. There always was. I remembered the way my grandfather had spoken of the lower acres, his mythic voice reserved for whispers at dusk when the wind caught the wheat. We don't drill there, he'd said. We don't sell there. That land paid for your grandmother's ring without a single shovel turned. It waits. It waits because patience makes men rich. I had loved the poetry of it without understanding. Years later, after he died, offers had come and we had said no because saying no felt like keeping a promise to a ghost. They found lithium, my husband said now, voice almost gone. Enough to electrify a fleet of cars, enough to write a future. The company that took our land sold the rights and the price climbed like a curse. And the men who brokered the deal, our son among them, made more money in paper than I had ever seen in life, while we kept paying the taxes on a house that creaked in winter above us. A hawk's cry cut a bright arc through the sky. I kept my body limp, my head turned so I could see his mouth shape the truth. I told him to keep me out of it, my husband said. I told him to take his chance, to start over clean, marry the woman he loved, build the life he wanted, and I would carry the sin of what I'd done alone. I believed the lie that secrets dissolve with time. But greed is a generational disease. It metastasizes. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the blue had dimmed to the color of storm water. Your daughter-in-law, he whispered, she found out about the land. She found out about the money. And she found out that if we both died without changing our will, everything would pass through him. She is a woman who thinks life is math. She thinks love is an equation you fix by erasing the variables that make it messy. Knuckles of wind pushed at the trees and the shadows changed shape. My throat ached with unshed cries. I thought of her high cheekbones and careful smile. Her eyes flicking over our living room like she was measuring its resale value. She had been kind to me in the way women are kind. When they are auditioning for the role of daughter, she had brought casseroles, offered to drive me to appointments, asked about my childhood with sincere curiosity. She had never once asked me whether I was happy. She told him no one would suspect, he said. An accident on a mountain trail. A misstep. A loose rock. And then she told him something worse. She told him that if he didn't do it, she would tell the world how he started their fortune, how I enabled it. She would name you, too. She would make the papers say you were complicit. Our son is many things, Savannah, but he couldn't bear the thought of you in headlines. So he pushed us, I thought, the words like a hand closing around my heart from inside. He who had once wrapped his arm tight around my shoulders when he was 5 and I'd fallen on ice. He who had cried when our old dog died because he said he didn't know where to put his hands without fur to hold. He pushed us. I told him to meet us today, my husband said. I told him we would go for a walk and talk about a new will. I thought to change his mind. I thought I could cut the fuse before it reached the powder. But when I saw her eyes, I knew the explosion had already happened. Savannah, I forced the fall. I blinked. Pain flared. What? I stepped wrong on purpose when I felt them close behind, he whispered. To make it look like I tripped, to give us momentum away from the shove. If we went down the way I chose, we might survive. The ledge beneath, his mouth twitched with a bitter smile. I studied this trail for weeks. I found the place where a fall is a lesson and not a death. The shove came anyway, but the angle. It saved us. Or it will, if we still have time. The word sliced me free. In the far distance, a car door thumped. Voices far away, maybe hikers. Or maybe they had not left after all. My skin felt open to the sky, a map of pain. I took a breath that tasted like a new life, and I moved on. It wasn't much at first. Just my fingers flexing, the tiny scuff of a shoe. He flinched. Careful, he breathed. They might still be up there. The slope under us gentle to scrub and fractured stone. If I could reach the shadow of a pine, I could hide, I could climb. My ribs argued with every plan. Blood warmed sticky under my shirt, fragrant and metallic. Yet I was alive. He was alive. The miracle of that made me greedy for more. I inched toward him and he grimaced but didn't protest. When my hand found his, I felt the tremor of his body like a bird caught in a chimney. We get out, I mouthed. He nodded, pain dissolving some part of the pride that had always stiffened his jaw. He let me be the stronger one. We moved like broken marionettes. Time snagged on every brush of thorns. Above, the sun pushed west, indifferent. Twice, pebbles tumbled from above and we froze, listening for the shape of feet. But the mountain kept its counsel. The second time, a voice drifted faintly, her voice laughing at something I could not hear. I tasted bile and swallowed it. We reached the trunk of a pine whose roots gripped the slope like an old man's hands. Behind it, a narrow seam of rock formed a ramp, not generous but possible. I pulled while he pushed with his good leg, and together we climbed the seam, inching into a shadow that smelled like pitch and dust and second chances. At the top of the ramp, a shelf widened enough to sit. I eased him into it, wiped the blood from his lips with the edge of my sleeve, and listened to the mountain breathe. "Savannah," he murmured, "if I die, you won't," I said. And I meant it not as hope but as a command to the universe. "If I do," he insisted. "Go to Faye." My surprise must have shown because he managed a strained laugh. "Your sister," he said. "Yes, I called her. Yes, I told her some of it. No, she didn't forgive me. But she knows a lawyer who believes land remembers its owners and titles can be resurrected. She told me the company that took the rights has a weakness. They've been laundering their claims through shell after shell. The chain breaks if someone pulls the right link." "Faye," I echoed, tasting childhood summers, the scent of peaches and gasoline from long drives to county fairs. The laughter we'd lost somewhere between my wedding and our own pride. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. Now she was the lighthouse. My husband leaned his head back against the rock. "Tell her I'm sorry," he said. "Tell her I waited too long to be brave." The shelf shivered with the far-off thump of boots. This time the footsteps were not fading but nearing. I put my mouth to his ear. "They're coming back." He let out a breath that trembled like paper. "Then that's our chance," he whispered. "Because if they find us gone, they'll hunt. But if they find only me..." No, the word was a blade. He squeezed my fingers with what little strength remained. "You're the one who can outlive this, Savannah. You always were. You know what to do with truth once you have it. I can't run. I'll slow you down. If they see me, they'll finish what they started and they'll think the story ends there. While they're writing the obituary, you'll be writing the future." I shook my head hard enough to jar my ribs. "I won't leave you." "You will," he said. And for a moment the old command in his voice returned, the patient, gentle man who fixed sinks and left roses by the coffee pot on ordinary Tuesdays. "You will because you love me, and because love is sometimes a door you close from the outside." The footsteps grew louder, gravel complaining under weight. I couldn't tell if it was one set or two. The shadows proposed a dozen terrible options. I looked at him, and I saw the boy he had been, the man he had tried to be. The father who had folded a terrible bargain into his chest like a live coal, and pretended he could carry it without being burned. I kissed his forehead. His skin was cold and tasted like salt and iron. "Forgive me," I whispered. "For what?" "For everything I'm about to do." The shelf ended in a cleft no wider than my hips, a dark funnel to the deeper scrub below. I slid into it, found footholds with my toes, and descended in a slow glide of pain. Behind me, he made a sound I could not read, prayer or goodbye. The voices neared until words separated from wind. "Should have checked the lower switchback," she said, and I heard the irritation in her. The way she had always been irritated by the existence of other people's wills. Animals could drag them further down. "We can't leave tracks," my son answered. And his voice broke something in me all over again because it still sounded like home. "You said the rain would come tonight," he murmured. "It will wash everything, and if it doesn't, then we take care of it." A pause. "Stop looking at me like that." "I did what you asked." I pressed myself into the rock. The cleft smelled like damp and thyme. I thought of the little boy who had once crept into our bed during thunderstorms, his damp hair sticking to his forehead, his small hand searching for mine. I thought of the man above me, whose hands had just pushed me into the sky. I reached the next ledge and began to crawl. Sand ground under my palms. The path angled left behind a boulder the size of a truck. If I could make it around. The slope fell into a stand of cedar where the trail widened, where hikers might offer water, where a ranger might carry a radio, where a life might resume. Behind me, a stone tumbled. Then another. I risked a glance back. Through the cleft I saw only a slice of sky and a boot heel. The boot turned, scraping rock. I slid soundlessly forward, tucked into the shadow of the boulder. and held my breath until my lungs scalded. Silence, then her voice again, bright with cruel curiosity. Funny, isn't it? How peace looks like mountains. My son said nothing. Let's go down one more level, she added. If the bodies are there, we need to be sure. Boots moved. I ran, such as running was possible in a body that had been thrown down a cliff. I ran in tiny, desperate bursts from shadow to shadow, from rock to root. My breath counting the world in increments. 5 steps, stop, listen. 4 steps, stop, listen. The trail widened. A thread of birdsong wove itself through the wind. Somewhere, water. I could drink the future if I only reached it. Savannah, a voice breathed. And for a terrible instant I thought it was my husband's ghost, but it was not a ghost. It was a ranger in a green jacket stepping out from the cedar stand with a hand raised. And behind him 2 hikers with wide eyes. Blood and dust must have made a flag of me. Their faces folded into shock and then into action. The ranger's radio crackled alive with sentences that sounded like salvation. Back there, I managed, my voice a rasp torn with pine needles. My husband. And my son, the words splintered. And his wife. They pushed us. They're still up there. He nodded once, the kind of nod that means the world has already reshaped itself to your words. He spoke into his radio. Within moments, the air filled with the choreography of rescue, static, bark directions. The distant thud of a helicopter that might yet be a dream. The hikers guided me to a log, wrapped a jacket around my shoulders, pressed a bottle of water into my hand that shook too hard to lift. One of them a woman with gray at her temples, and kindness carved into the lines around her eyes, held the bottle for me like it was a sacrament. Tell me your name, she said. Savannah. Savannah. You're safe now, but safety is a negotiation with 1,000 wild variables. And mine had only just begun. Because on the wind, faint but undeniable, came the sound of a scream, short, sharp, and silenced. It was not my husband's voice. It was the voice of a woman who had never expected pain to choose her. The ranger sprinted toward the trail with a speed that did not belong to mortals. I clutched the bottle as if it could anchor me to this earth. The helicopter's thrum grew louder, throwing leaves into a frenzy. People shouted coordinates. I heard my own heart like a drum calling an army to battle. They brought my husband up on a stretcher with a neck collar and an oxygen mask and the pallor of someone who has already visited the border between here and elsewhere. His eyes found me, and in them I saw the thin line of hope taut as a violin string. I reached for his fingers and he found mine. And we built a bridge between 2 stretchers with our knuckles. My son sat on a rock nearby, wrists cuffed behind his back, head bowed in a posture so boyish it pierced me. A second ranger stood over him with the impassive patience of a mountain. My son did not look at me. His wife was nowhere I could see. She fell, the second ranger said later when I asked. Voice gentle, a candle in his mouth. She slipped when she tried to climb down to the ledge. We don't know yet if she'll make it. The medevac took her first. She was closer to the edge, a small, mean part of me felt a shard of satisfaction and then hated myself immediately for it. The larger part felt only the numb exhaustion of someone who has watched the wheel of cause and effect roll over her family and keep going. At the hospital, fluorescent lights bleached the world. They stitched me and scanned me and folded me into the complicated embrace of machines. When I slept, it was a collage of sky and stone, of voices turning into wind. When I woke, my sister was in the chair by the window, elbows on knees, face in her hands. She looked up when I stirred, and whatever arguments had calcified between us over the years fell away like old bark. You're lucky, she said. Lucky you're the stubbornest woman I know. You came, I murmured. Of course I came. Someone had to glare at the doctors until they told me the truth. Her mouth softened. He told me to be ready, But I knew. My husband. The man who had tried to be brave too late and still managed at the last to be brave exactly when it mattered. He told me to call Mara Winters, Faye said, pulling a card from her purse. Top of her class, teeth like diamonds. A heart rumor says she keeps in a locked drawer, but I've seen it beat. She does property law like it's poetry. She's already started digging into the chain of title on your land. Thinks she can rip it apart like old lace, can she? If anyone can, Faye sat back and exhaled hard. There's more. The sheriff wants a statement. There are recordings. Recordings? Faye's eyes glittered with the kind of pride older sisters only admit in emergencies. Do you think I drove all night just to hold your hand? I stopped at your house first. Found the envelope your husband left with the neighbor. Inside was a thumb drive. He recorded their conversation on the mountain last week. She said too many clever things. He said too many cowardly ones. Jurors like tapes. So do reporters. The word made a hollow sound inside me. It echoed with the image of my son in handcuffs. His face turned away as if shame had finally located him. He's still my boy, I said quietly. Even monsters are somebody's baby picture. Faye's mouth pressed into a line both firm and forgiving. We'll help where we can. But first we help you. We help the truth. When the sheriff came, I told him everything in a voice that sounded like mine from far away. When the lawyer arrived, she listened like someone who had used listening to knock down walls. She asked questions that braided law and mercy. She took the thumb drive like a priest receiving confession. And when she left, the room felt a little sturdier. My husband woke the next morning with more color in his cheeks and a stubborn light under his bruises. He tried to apologize again, and I let him finish because the ritual mattered. Because the act of placing blame and forgiveness on the table like salt and bread is how people live together after war. Then I told him the thing I had known since the fall: we are not the sum of our worst bargains. We are what we do after. He turned his face and pressed it into my palm. My fingers smelled like hospital soap. I threaded them through his hair where gray had overwhelmed the chestnut, and felt the thrum of his pulse enter mine. News traveled faster than our ability to process it. By afternoon, a local station had already run the headline, "Couple Survives Mountain Fall. Son and wife under investigation." Commenters built bonfires of opinion. Strangers sent prayers like paper boats. The company that had eaten our land tried to issue a statement thick with neutral words. Mara shredded it with a single email and set the stage for something larger than any of us had imagined, a case that suggested wealth is not only money but memory, not only contracts but promises handed down like quilts. Days blurred into the careful choreography of recovery and preparation. I learned the rhythms of lawyers and the dialect of detectives. I watched my son across steel and glass in a visiting room, his face thinner, his eyes less certain of their right to be bright. We talked about Little League and lies. About the night he first decided a shortcut could save him from himself. About the woman he thought love could fix. I told him I loved him with a fierceness that made the guard cough and look away. I told him love did not erase consequence. I told him I would testify. He nodded once, as if someone had finally given him the permission he'd always secretly wanted. To stop pretending the math ever added up. When the first hearing came, the courthouse smelled of dust and old ambition. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one that felt like a yes strung bead by bead. The room hummed with the slow electricity of anger-seeking ground. Cameras clicked like insects. The judge's bench loomed, polished to a moral shine. They called my name. I stood. I told the story of a mountain and a fall, of a whisper that said pretend to be dead, of a truth that rose from blood and pine. I spoke of land and promises, of signatures that sliced families in ways knives never could, of a son I loved and a woman who thought love was a lever that could move God. I did not dramatize. The facts were drama enough. I did not cry. Tears would come later in the privacy of a kitchen that understood me. I spoke and the room listened. And for a long moment the system did what it is supposed to do. It served the story of what happened. When the recordings played, the jury flinched like a single animal. Her voice filled the speakers, cool and relentless, telling him where to stand, when to push, how to keep his hands clean. His voice wove through hers, a tremor of doubt and eagerness and the sick hope of someone who imagines the future. We'll forgive him for the present. The judge's face did not change, but the air did. Afterward, outside on the steps, reporters wanted me to choose between victim and mother. I refused the choice. I am both, I said. And I am also a farmer's granddaughter who knows that when land is hurt, the people on it bleed. Mar put a hand on my elbow and guided me away like a conductor ending a symphony. With a graceful wrist. At the bottom of the steps, Faye waited with coffee and a look that said we weren't done. Not by half, but we were pointed in the right direction. Weeks became a season. Leaves let go. Snow threatened. In court, details multiplied, deeds, emails, dates. Words like encumbrance and fiduciary duty and unconscionable. Outside, life insisted on being ordinary, mail, soup, the ache in my knees when it rained. My husband grew stronger, the scar on his forehead bright as a comet tail. Sometimes at night he would wake with a start and reach for me. To make sure the world still had me in it, I would press his hand to my throat so he could count the proof. Then a day came when the judge's words rearranged our future. The corporation's chain of title broke where Mara had predicted. The land knew its name. It came home. The court ordered an injunction, then a disgorgement. The papers called it a landmark ruling. I called it my grandfather's patience paying out at last. As for my son, there are no tidy bows on a story like his. He pled to what he could not outrun. He stood in a room that smelled like bleach and apology and said the word guilty in a voice that steadied as it spoke. He is serving time. He writes to me every week on paper so thin you can almost see the next letter waiting behind the first. He is learning how to live inside longer sentences than he ever cared to read. He asks about the mountain, whether the hawk still nests above the trail. I tell him yes. I tell him everything nests where it cannot. His wife survived. She pled to, and the law had fewer soft places for her. She appealed. She blamed. She learned that math can add up to a prison term just as easily as it adds up to a mansion. I have not walked the mountain path again, not yet. I keep the shoes I wore that day by the door as if someday I'll slip into them, and their memory will guide me back to the place where the world threw us down and then, inexplicably, offered its hand. The lower acres are quiet. We do not drill. We do not sell. We placed a bench near the cedar stand and carved words in it that only our family would understand. Patience is a kind of riches. People sit there now who do not know our names and breathe the clean air and say to each other that the view is fine. I like that. I like that our story is a secret told by wind to those who don't need to hear it to live well. At supper sometimes, my husband will look at me with the expression of a man who has climbed back into his body and found it worth living in. He will squeeze my hand. We will not talk about bargains or cliffs. We will talk about the neighbor's new dog, about the frost coming early, about my sister's plan to plant peonies in a place that has never liked flowers. We will talk about the grandchildren we might yet meet, born of a son who will leave his old arithmetic behind, and in the quiet afterward, when the house clicks and sighs into night, I will go to the window and look out at the line of trees black against the afterglow. I will say my name softly to remind myself that I am here, Savannah Parker, 63 years old, survivor of a fall that looked like ending and turned out to be a beginning with sharper edges. I will press my hand to the glass and feel the cold and think of the ledge, of the whisper that saved us, of the truth that broke us and built us again. This is not forgiveness as absolution. This is forgiveness as architecture. I build a home out of it, beam by beam. I live there. I leave the door unlocked, just in case the world needs a place to sit and rest and listen to the wind tell the old story. One more time, the one where we fell, and we rose, and somewhere between the two, we learned how to live. Months turned into years, and the echoes of that mountain day never left me. They softened, yes, but like a scar that pulses when the weather changes. The memory of the cliff and the whisper pretend to be dead remained carved into me. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn, tangled in sheets, the phantom weight of falling still tugging at my stomach. I'd reach out, and my hand would find my husband's chest rising slow and steady, proof that life had not abandoned us. Only then would I let myself breathe. Our land, once nearly stolen, became more than soil and stone. The court victory brought reporters and activists, letters from strangers who wanted me to know that our fight had sparked something larger. We began to receive invitations, conferences about environmental justice, panels about inheritance rights, gatherings of farmers and families who had been silenced by corporations for too long. I, Savannah Parker, who once thought herself just a wife, a mother, a keeper of recipes and traditions, found myself standing at podiums, telling a story into microphones, watching audiences lean forward as if the truth itself could feed them. But even as the world applauded, my heart lived in two directions. On one side was pride, the acres safe again, the future no longer mortgaged to greed. On the other side was grief, my son behind bars, his letters filling a box by my bed. I read them so often that the creases wore thin. He wrote of books he was reading, history, philosophy, even poetry. He wrote of the men he met inside, of mistakes larger than his, of lives lost to cycles he now recognized too late. He ended every letter the same way. I am trying to be the boy you loved, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever succeed, but I am trying, and I always wrote back, keep trying. That is enough for now. Faye, my sister, became my closest ally again. We stitched our relationship back together, one conversation at a time, usually over coffee that turned cold while we revisited years we had wasted in silence. Funny, isn't it? She said once, watching me stir sugar into a chipped mug. It took cliffs and courts and criminals for us to remember we were born from the same woman. I laughed, a sound sharper than I meant, but it melted into something warmer. Maybe the world had to break us so we'd fit together again, I replied. My husband never fully regained the strength he'd had before the fall, but he carried his cane with the dignity of a general. He began painting landscapes of the lower acres, the mountains at dusk, the hawk that still circled above the trail where we had almost died. His brush strokes were heavy at first, uncertain, but soon they steadied. When he showed me his first finished canvas, he said, "This is what it feels like to keep breathing." I framed it and hung it above our fireplace, where its colors burned against the stone like a permanent sunrise. There came a spring morning when the mail brought something unexpected. A letter from my daughter-in-law, the woman who had plotted my death. It was brief, written in a cramped hand. Savannah, I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't give it if I were you. But prison has a way of stripping people to the bone. I see now that I loved your son less than I loved the idea of power. I made him a weapon and then blamed him for cutting. I know you will never trust me. You shouldn't, but if someday he finds a way back to the world, please don't let him carry my sins as well as his own. Let him lay me down where I belong. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it back into its envelope. I never replied. Some truths are acknowledged only in silence. As the seasons turned, I returned at last to the mountain. Not to the path of the fall, not yet, but to a gentler trail nearby. I climbed slowly, my ribs still aching when the air grew thin, but I climbed. When I reached the summit, the valley spread before me like a quilt stitched in greens and golds. I sat on a rock and whispered my name into the wind, Savannah Parker. The echo came back softer, as if the mountain had accepted me, scar and all. One day, when my son's sentence ends, I will bring him here. I will show him the bench by the cedar stand, the acres we saved, the horizon his greed almost erased. I will tell him that the story is not over, that it never is, as long as breath fills our lungs. And until then, I keep writing, keep speaking, keep living. Because I fell once and I rose. And in the space between those two truths, I discovered who I truly was, not just a survivor, but a woman who learned how to turn a terrible fall into the foundation of a life worth telling. I understood. I sat by the window that evening, the house breathing its ordinary breath, and I let the valley's last light pool across the floorboards. The letter from her lay folded on the table like something alive that had been put into a jar. Outside, the hawk circled once and settled on the same dead limb it favored each season, blinking as if it, too, had watched too much of the world to be surprised anymore. When the phone rang, it was Mara Winters. Her voice was brisk, efficient, the kind that trims away everything unnecessary. "They want to settle," she said without preamble. "Not for the headline. For the records. They'll offer cash. They'll offer non-disclosure. They'll ask you to sign away any public comment about what happened." I looked at the bench beneath the cedars, at the carved letters that had begun to smooth with rain. Asterisk, patience is a kind of riches. Asterisk I had fought so hard to keep that land out of the hands of men who reduced everything to spreadsheets and profit margins. The thought of them turning our story into a purchase order made something in me ache. No, I said after a moment. The word felt like stone and felt like prayer. We didn't take the fight up there to sell it back to them in silence. We keep the courthouse record open. We keep the lessons loud. Mara paused, then laughed softly in admiring sound. You're stubborn in a good way, she said. All right. They'll press. They'll make it look merciful. They'll put the offer on the table and then try to make you feel cruel if you refuse. Don't let them do that. Refusing an offer is a peculiar kind of violence. It forces other people to show their hands. I expected threats and lawyerly posturing, and I got them. I expect today's newspapers to call us mercenary for taking a victory and refusing to sanitize it with a check. The same town that applauded now whispered that maybe we'd go too far. But the bench stayed. The bench next to the cedars where ordinary people could come and feel the valley breathe. I liked that the bench could not be bought with polite money. Winter became a slow liturgy of recovery. My husband's hands steadied enough to lift a brush without trembling so violently that the colors blurred. He painted another landscape, this one, the cedar stand. Dull golds and greens that somehow captured the way light lives on the edges of things. He gave it to Faye for her birthday, and she wept in the kitchen like a child. Her hands tangled in the paper. My son's letters changed, too. Once bitter edges softened into sentences that asked for small things: news of the hawk, gossip about the neighbor's cow, whether the peonies had finally decided to bloom. His world inside was narrower than it used to be and, in a way, more honest. He wrote of people he'd met who had never had milk or a father to call, of the small mercies that a library book could offer. He wrote that he was attending a class on mediation, and he hoped, when he got out, to work with youth so they wouldn't end up believing that easy money is the same as freedom. There were days, of course, when the house felt too quiet for the speech I used to give on stages. I'd wake at 3 in the morning, the way some old clocks kept time by turning over memories. And I would go to the kitchen for water and find myself tracing the grain of the table with my thumb. Each groove had a story now: the scrape from when the dog knocked over the vase, the burn mark from the time my husband tried to flam strawberries and nearly burned down the holiday, the stain from the bottle of ink my son had splattered when he was 10. Pretending to be a great novelist, I told myself not to scrub them clean. They were maps. The house was a map of how we had lived, loved, and hurt. Sometimes visitors came: a woman from the Environmental Coalition, a reporter who wanted the essay version of my life, a farmer whose century-old fence line was threatened by the same kind of paper chains the corporation had used. I took calls and signed petitions and wrote a column in a small state paper about the invisible economics that swallow people whole. The more public I became, the more private my family retreated into that small inner chamber where we were not case studies, but a husband, a wife, a son, and a sister. One late afternoon, Faye found me in the garden pruning roses. She crouched beside me and without preamble said he sent another request. She held out an envelope, the handwriting small and deliberate. He wants to come home for a weekend. He asked if you would bring him to the bench. My hand paused over a stem. The scent of crushed petals rose up. My first impulse was to say no. I had images of courthouse stairs, of whispered questions from strangers, of my son awkward with the freedom that frightens someone who has grown used to walls. Yet another part of me, the part that had always measured life in small, patient acts, knew that exile without the chance for repair is a different kind of cruelty. If redemption is to mean anything, it must be allowed to practice its muscles somewhere. Bring him, I said finally, but not alone. Faye will come. Mara will be nearby if he needs anything. And he must agree to meet me at the bench. We'll start there. The weekend came with a sun that felt too clean to be true. When they brought him through the gate, he was smaller than my memory and larger in the ways that time stretches a man. He had the same stubborn jaw, but his eyes were lined with a patience that prison shapes in narrow bands. He walked slowly, as if learning his feet again. And when he saw the bench, he stopped as if he had found a shore. He sat beside me, and at first we only breathed the same air, to people counting the same small horizon. Then he turned, and his mouth moved in the way a man's does when he is trying to make amends without a script. "Mother," he said, "I don't expect you to forgive me today. I don't expect to either," I answered. "But forgive me for what? For being alive? For wanting you back?" "That isn't the same thing." He blinked, and a small laugh escaped him. It sounded like a rusty hinge. "I am not the same boy. I thought I could buy a life. I thought money was a ladder people could climb and not look down. I was wrong. I took the ladder and I saw there were nails where my hands should have been." "You took other people's names with your hands," I said gently. "There are people who cannot unwrite what was done." He nodded. "I know. I have been trying to make a list, to put things right where I can. It's slow. It's not enough. But I am trying." There was a long, honest silence as the hawk turned in a lazy circle above us. A boy who had once thought himself clever now had to learn how to make everyday kindness a practice. We spoke about small things, how to prune roses so they bloom later, which seeds to plant for bees, the names of the old men who used to fix the fences. We spoke carefully so as not to let the old, jagged things reopen too wide. When he left that weekend, it was not a triumphant homecoming nor a neat reconciliation. It was a step, one foot after the other, into a life that would have to be rebuilt brick by careful brick. He promised to volunteer at the community center, to work with the youth on courses about making choices, to teach them that shortcuts can become prisons. It was not heroic. It was humble. It was, in its own way, precisely what a penitent life looks like. Years move like that, small, insistent rhythms instead of dramatic revelations. The corporation tried again to muscle into the state legislature. A new shell company appeared with the same polished executives and the same polite words. Mara kept at their throat with filings and hearings until the company's attempts to launder claims collapsed in a series of Kafkaesque failures. It took patience and paper and a dogged belief that legal reality would honor reality itself. When at last the courts ordered sanctions against the shells and restored more than our titles, restoring dignity in paperwork. If such a thing sounds absurd, I sat quietly in the courtroom and felt something inside me unclench. People praised me, and sometimes I felt undeserving of the praise. I remember once standing on a stage in a hall full of young farmers and telling them that the hard thing about losing is that sometimes you have to give up the idea of being the kind of person who is only loved for victories. You have to learn to be loved for persistence, for kindness, for the work you do underground that no one sees. After the talk, a young woman pressed a wooden charm into my hand, a tiny carved hawk. "So you don't forget," she said. At home, life continued. My husband's paintings gathered in a small room we called the studio. Sometimes he would sit with a cup of tea and tell me the way light had surprised him that morning, and I would listen and learn how to be delighted by small discoveries again. Faye and I started a little program that taught children about land stewardship, how soil remembers, and why patience can be a kind of currency. We taught children to plant wills and maps, not as legal documents but as care instructions for a life that will outlast them. One autumn, my son brought his own son to the bench for the first time. The boy was shy, hovering at the edge of the cedar shadow, clutching a soccer ball. I watched my son speak to him words about how the world is clumsy and beautiful, about how mistakes can be stopped from becoming templates, and how forgiveness is not a single act but a practice. Watching grandfather to grandson unfold in the same skin that once made such terrible miscalculations made something like mending grow in me. It was not that the past was erased. It was simply that its edges were softer when the next generation pressed their own fingers to the same knots. There were nights I would wake and find my husband gone from bed to sit by the window, his silhouette a slow prayer. I'd go to him and we would hold hands without speaking. Sometimes he would murmur, "We did right, even if it hurt." And I would press his palm to my cheek because who are we, if not the sum of our small reconciliations? Toward the end, I began to understand that the fall had not been a single moment but a long season. It had been a reckoning that unraveled and rewove us in ways that made the fabric stronger, if no less marked. I could still feel the old terror in my bones and electric twinge when I stepped too close to the ledge on a windy day, but that twinge had become a caution lamp, not an executioner. One afternoon, years after the day the mountain nearly swallowed us, I drove up to the cedar stand alone. The road was slick with recent rain and the air smelled like dirt and possibility. I sat on the bench and opened the box of my son's old letters, the ones he'd written from inside. They were thin with use, pages softened by thumb and time. I read them again, the sentences tracing the path he had taken from confusion into contrition. I thought about the woman who had once plotted to erase us, about the man who had made a terrible bargain to protect his son, about the son who had fallen and now chose to climb out in the shade of the cedars, with the valley spread out like a patient story. I wrote a letter of my own, not to be published, not to be held up as an example, but to be folded and kept. I wrote to the boy I was at 20 who thought the world could be negotiated with charm and force. And I told her what I had learned, that truth wins not because it is loud, but because it is tenacious. That love costs and sometimes asks for the humility of waiting. That riches of patience cannot be cashed in at a counter but do buy you a lifetime of mornings. When I folded the letter and tucked it into the box, a hawk flew low past me and then climbed higher until it was nothing but a dot against the sun. I smiled, and in that smile there was no triumph, only the steady recognition that we had all been given the chance to become someone slightly better than we were yesterday. I do not know how many seasons are left for me. I do not pretend to be any wiser than I was before I tumbled off that ledge. But I know the shape of my days now, a life that keeps returning to the bench, to the studio, to letters, to the slow work of planting and stewardship. In the evenings, when the house settles and the light goes soft, my husband and I walk the garden together. We speak of simple things, the neighbor's cat, the way rain smells after drought, the small triumph of a peony that finally decides to bloom. We speak in the language of people who have kept one another through the hard weather. There are no fairy tale endings here. There are only afternoons that add up to a life in a bench that holds our names. And the carved truth that * patience is a kind of riches. * if someone asks me now why I told the story on stages and in courtrooms, I tell them plainly, because truth must be tended. Because a fall can become a foundation if you are willing to do the work of rebuilding brick by patient brick. So I keep writing, keep speaking, keep shaping my days into honest patterns. I keep the letters in a box by my bedside and read them sometimes when the nights feel too long. I keep the bench polished enough for hands to rest on and rough enough to remind me of the mountain. I keep the lower acres quiet and watch them breathe. And in the hush between dusk and dark, when the valley exhales and the hawk circles once more, I say my name into the wind and it says mine back, Savannah Parker, 63 years old, a woman who fell, who survived, and who spent the rest of her days making sure that what nearly killed her became the ground she stood on. The years have folded into one another like pages of a book read too many times, edges softened, words remembered even in silence. My son came home at last, older, humbled. No longer the reckless boy who thought money could buy peace. He works now with young men at the community center, teaching them to see temptation for what it is, a cliff disguised as a road. Sometimes, when I watch him tie his son's shoes or guide a trembling hand through homework, I see the boy I raised return to me in fragments. My husband still paints. His body bends with age, but his hand, steady now, traces skies and valleys as though each brush stroke were a hymn. Our house has become a gallery of seasons, the mountain at dawn, the cedar bench in snow, the hawk wheeling against endless sky. He tells me he paints not to capture but to release, as though each canvas lets him set down a little more of the burden he carried all those years. Faye and I remain close. We speak almost every day, sometimes of land and law, sometimes only of soup recipes and aching knees. It still amazes me how easily love can return once pride is put down. Together, we tend the lower acres not for profit but for memory. Children come on field trips to learn how land is more than property, how patience outlives greed. They run between the cedars, their laughter scattering the ghosts that once lingered there. As for me, I have learned to live gently with scars. The mountain no longer terrifies me. It steadies me. When I walk the trail, I hear the echo of that whisper pretend to be dead, but now I understand it differently. It was not just survival. It was a command to pause, to let the false world die so the true one could rise. On my last visit to the cedar bench, I sat with my son on one side and my grandson on the other. 3 generations bound by blood, by mistake, by forgiveness. The valley spread before us like an old quilt, patched but warm. My grandson traced the carved words with his small fingers. Patience is a kind of riches, and asked, "Grandma, what does it mean?" I smiled, the weight of years soft on my shoulders. "It means," I told him, "that sometimes the richest thing you can do is wait for life to show you what matters. It means we are not poor when we have love and time." He nodded, as if he understood more than a child should. The hawk circled once above, then disappeared into the horizon. I knew then that my story was not one of betrayal or survival alone, but of transformation. I had fallen, yes, but I had also risen. And in rising, I had built a life stronger than the one I lost. So let this be my ending. I am Savannah Parker. I was pushed, I fell, I bled, I endured. I stood again, not as the same woman, but as one remade by truth. And if the world remembers anything of me, let it be this: that I turned a fall meant to kill me into the ground, upon which I learned how to live.